In rural North Dakota, a 68-year-old widow was about to face devastating betrayal. What started as a routine February morning took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her daughter-in-law's brutal ultimatum. Margaret Hansen wasn't your typical grandmother. For 43 years, she had been the backbone of a multigenerational farming family, known for unwavering loyalty. When she encountered the cold demand to get out, she had no idea she was walking into exile that would expose buried family secrets. Margaret's dignified response would lead to discoveries about her late son's hidden desperation. What began as family conflict would become profound transformation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The photograph fell from Margaret's trembling fingers, landing face down on the hardwood floor she'd polished just yesterday morning. David's graduation picture. College, not high school. The one where he wore that crooked smile and looked so much like his father. She bent to retrieve it, her arthritic knees protesting, and for a moment the only sound in the farmhouse was the whisper of tissue paper against glass as she wrapped it carefully. "We don't have space for you. Get out." Beth's words hung in the February air like ice crystals, sharp and cutting. Margaret had heard them 20 minutes ago, standing in this same front room where 3 generations of Hansens had celebrated Christmas mornings and birthday parties and the small victories that made up a life. Where David had taken his first steps. Where she'd held Tommy as a colicky baby while Beth slept upstairs, exhausted from night feedings. The irony wasn't lost on her. This house had plenty of space, 4 bedrooms, a den, a formal dining room they'd used maybe twice a year. But Beth hadn't meant physical space, and they both knew it. Margaret moved with deliberate precision through the rooms, selecting items that mattered. The wooden jewelry box David had made in shop class, her mother's china teacups, just 2, not the whole set. The Afghan she'd knitted during the long winter after Harold died. Each object was a small rebellion against the finality of Beth's words, a statement that some things couldn't be taken away. In the kitchen doorway, Beth remained motionless, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She wore the same pose she'd adopted during all their recent arguments, defensive, immovable. But Margaret caught the way Beth's jaw clenched when Margaret passed with Harold's old coffee mug, the one with the faded John Deere logo. Some battles weren't worth fighting, but others cut too deep to ignore. "Mom, please." Tommy's voice cracked slightly on the word please, betraying the 16-year-old. Beneath his attempt at adult reasoning. "Maybe we can all just— Tommy, go to your room." Beth's voice cut across his words like a blade through wheat. "But now." Margaret watched her grandson's face crumple slightly before he caught himself, straightening his shoulders the way David used to do when he was determined not to cry. The boy looked between the 2 women, his dark eyes, David's eyes, searching for some hint that this was temporary, fixable, a misunderstanding that adults could resolve with enough talking. Margaret wanted to tell him it would be okay. The lie formed on her lips, sweet and familiar as the lullabies she'd sung when he was small. But lies had gotten them here, hadn't they? All the things they hadn't said, the conversations they'd avoided, the problems they'd let fester like infection in an untreated wound. "It's all right, Tommy." She kept her voice steady, though her chest felt tight as a fist. "Your mother has made her decision." The words tasted bitter, but they were true. This wasn't a conversation or a negotiation. It was an eviction, pure and simple, delivered by someone who'd once called her Mom, with tears in her eyes on her wedding day. Tommy's footsteps echoed on the stairs, each step a small defeat. Margaret heard his bedroom door close, not slam, he was too careful for that, and the house settled into a silence that felt vast and empty, despite 2 people still breathing within its walls. Beth shifted slightly, and Margaret caught the movement in her peripheral vision. For a moment, she thought Beth might speak, might offer some explanation that would make sense of this fracture. Instead, Beth turned and walked toward the kitchen, her sock feet making no sound on the linoleum David had installed 2 summers ago. Margaret folded another sweater into her suitcase, the brown wool one Beth had given her last Christmas. The gesture felt pointed now, deliberate. She'd wear it every day if she had to, a reminder of when they'd still been family and more than name. The heating system kicked on with a familiar rumble, and Margaret realized she'd been cold for minutes without noticing. The house felt different already, as if her belongings had been keeping it warm and their absence was letting winter seep through the walls. She pulled on her heavy coat, the navy one Harold had bought her for their 40th anniversary, and hefted her suitcase. At the front door, she paused. 43 years she'd lived in this house. 43 years of meals. Cooked, floors cleaned, children raised, grandchildren loved. 43 years of being needed, of having a place where she belonged without question. Behind her, she heard Beth's sharp intake of breath, as if the other woman had been holding it since Margaret started packing. Margaret didn't turn around. Some moments required dignity more than understanding, and this was one of them. The cold hit her face like a slap as she stepped outside. February in North Dakota was unforgiving on the best of days, and today felt particularly cruel. The wind carried the promise of snow, and the sky pressed down gray and heavy as a shroud. Her car sat in the driveway where she'd parked it yesterday evening, back when she'd still lived here, back when home meant something different. Margaret loaded her suitcase into the trunk, then stood for a moment beside the driver's door, keys cold in her palm. Through the kitchen window, she could see Beth's silhouette, motionless as a statue. Watching, waiting, making sure she actually left. The Sunset Motel sat on the edge of town like an afterthought, its neon sign missing letters and its parking lot pocked with potholes that had been there since Margaret was middle-aged. She'd driven past it thousands of times over the decades, never imagining she'd need to know the price of a room or whether they offered weekly rates. The desk clerk was young, maybe Tommy's age, with tired eyes and the pallor of someone who worked night shifts. He didn't ask questions when she requested a room, just slid the registration card across the counter and waited while she printed her name in letters that looked foreign to her own eyes. Margaret Hansen. No address to list anymore. Room 14 smelled like disinfectant and old cigarettes, despite the no-smoking sign bolted to the door. The carpet was industrial brown, chosen to hide stains, and the bedspread had seen better decades. Margaret set her suitcase on the single chair and surveyed. Her new home. 68 years old, and this was what her life had become. A 12 by 14 room with a window that looked out onto the interstate, where semis carried cargo to places that mattered more than the woman they'd leave behind in their diesel exhaust. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. 5 minutes to mourn the life she'd lost, the family that had crumbled, the grandson she might not see again. 5 minutes to feel sorry for herself and rage at the unfairness of it all. Then she dried her eyes, hung up her coat, and began the work of figuring out how to survive. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and promising a long, cold night ahead. But Margaret Hansen had weathered worse storms than this. She'd buried a husband, raised a son, and helped raise a grandson. She'd learned that surviving meant putting one foot in front of the other, even when you couldn't see where the path led. Tomorrow, she'd start building whatever came next. Tonight, she'd simply endure. Margaret's hand trembled as she turned the key in the lock of room 14 for the 7th time in as many days. The metal felt foreign between her fingers, nothing like the smooth brass handle of the farmhouse door she'd turned, without thinking for 4 decades. Each click of the mechanism reminded her that this was temporary. It had to be temporary, even as the stack of $20 bills in her purse grew thinner with each passing night. The radiator beneath the window clanged to life as she entered. filling the cramped space with the smell of old metal and stale heat. She'd grown accustomed to the sound, the way it punctuated the silence that stretched between the rumble of trucks on the interstate and the muffled conversations that leaked through the paper-thin walls. Room 13 housed a traveling salesman who talked too loudly on his phone about quarterly reports. Room 15 remained empty, its silence somehow more oppressive than any noise. Margaret hung her coat on the single hook beside the bathroom door and surveyed her temporary kingdom. Her suitcase sat open on the dresser, its contents organized with the same precision she'd once applied to her spice cabinet. Underwear folded into neat squares, sweaters arranged by color. The wooden jewelry box positioned exactly where she could see it from the bed, a small anchor of familiarity in this sea of beige anonymity. She'd established routines. Coffee at 7, instant, bitter, but hot. A walk around the motel parking lot for exercise, stepping carefully around the potholes filled with ice. Breakfast at the vending machine, crackers and a granola bar that tasted like cardboard but provided sustenance. The young desk clerk, Marcus, she'd learned, nodded at her each morning, a gesture that felt both kind and pitying. At 10:30, she allowed herself to look at her phone. No messages, no missed calls. The silence from the farm felt deliberate, calculated. She wondered if Tommy was in school, if he was eating enough, if Beth was managing the morning chores, alone. David had always handled the livestock before dawn, his boots crunching through snow toward the barn while the rest of the world still slept. Margaret sat on the bed's edge and opened her small notebook, spiral-bound, the kind she'd used for grocery lists and appointment reminders. Now it served a different purpose. Day 7, she wrote in her careful script, spent $8 on room, $4 on food, remaining $247. At this rate, she had perhaps 2 weeks before decisions would need to be made, decisions she couldn't yet face. A soft knock interrupted her calculations. Margaret's heart jumped. Tommy? But when she opened the door, she found Marcus standing in the hallway, his uniform shirt wrinkled from a long shift. Mrs. Hansen? Sorry to bother you, but there's someone here asking about you. Her pulse quickened. Tommy? Marcus shook his head. Older lady. Says she's from the diner in town? Dolly something? Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Dolores Knudsen. Of course. In a town this size, secrets lasted about as long as fresh snow in April. Tell her I'll be right there. She found Dolly standing beside a battered pickup truck. In the parking lot, her gray hair whipped by the wind into a style that defied both gravity and fashion. At 72, Dolly remained formidable, 5 feet of pure determination wrapped in a parka that had seen better decades. Margaret Rose Hansen. Dolly's voice carried the authority of someone who'd known her since they were 6 years old, sharing crayon stubs in first grade. What in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing? Living my life. Margaret crossed her arms against the cold. Such as it is. In a motel that charges by the hour? Dolly's eyes swept the sunset's peeling exterior with undisguised disdain. Have you lost your ever-loving mind? The words stung because they echoed Margaret's own thoughts during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. I don't have many options right now, Dolly. That's horse hockey, and you know it. Dolly stepped closer, her voice dropping to the tone she'd used when they were teenagers, and she was about to propose something that would get them both in trouble. You've got friends. You've got people who care about you. You've got a brain in your head that's apparently taken a vacation. Margaret wanted to argue, to defend her choices, but the words wouldn't form. How could she explain the shame that burned in her chest? The humiliation of being unwanted by her own family? The way Beth's words had stripped away not just her home, but her sense of worth? Tommy came by the diner yesterday, Dolly continued, her expression softening slightly. Looking like a lost puppy. Asked if I'd seen you. Margaret's breath caught. What did you tell him? That his grandmother was tougher than old boot leather and twice as stubborn. Dolly's smile held no humor. But that boy's hurting, Margaret. They all are. Beth made her feelings clear. Beth's scared out of her mind and doing what scared people do, lashing out at whoever's closest. Dolly pulled her parka tighter. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. A semi roared past on the interstate, its diesel exhaust adding another layer to the chemical smell that permeated everything at the sunset. Margaret watched its taillights disappear toward the horizon, carrying its cargo to places where families probably stayed together, where 68-year-old women didn't find themselves homeless in February. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Come to the diner tomorrow," Dolly said, her voice gentler now. "Let me feed you something that didn't come from a vending machine. Let's talk about this like the intelligent women we're supposed to be." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Dolly squeezed her shoulder, a brief touch that somehow contained 40 years of friendship, and climbed into her truck. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, and Margaret watched until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Back in room 14, she updated her notebook. Day 7, evening. Dolly knows. Tomorrow, diner. Decision point approaching. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and promising another long night ahead. But for the first time since Beth's ultimatum, Margaret felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Tomorrow, she would take the first step toward whatever came next. Margaret pushed through the glass door of Dolly's diner. At exactly 11 o'clock, the brass bell announcing her arrival with the same cheerful chime that had welcomed her countless times over the decades. The familiar warmth enveloped her immediately. Not just the physical heat that chased away February's bite, but the deeper comfort of a place where she'd celebrated Tommy's first steps, mourned Harold's passing, and shared 1,000 small confidences with the woman who knew her better than anyone. Dolly looked up from the coffee pot she was refilling, her eyes sharp as always but softened by something that might have been relief. "About time. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve along with your common sense." The diner held. Perhaps a dozen customers scattered across red vinyl booths that had been ancient when Margaret was young. She recognized most faces: farmers grabbing late breakfast before afternoon chores, retired men who gathered daily to solve the world's problems over endless coffee refills, the Methodist minister's wife treating herself to pie before her weekly grocery run. Small-town life meant privacy was a luxury few could afford, and Margaret felt the weight of curious glances as she slid into the corner booth Dolly indicated. "Coffee's fresh," Dolly announced, appearing with a steaming mug before Margaret had fully settled. "And before you start with that proud nonsense, breakfast is on the house. I need the company more than you need to pay." Margaret wrapped her hands around the mug, savoring warmth that penetrated deeper than her bones. Real coffee, strong and bitter the way Harold used to make it during harvest season, not the instant crystals that dissolved into disappointment at the Sunset Motel. "How bad is it?" Dolly asked without preamble, sliding into the opposite seat with her own coffee. At 72, she'd earned the right to skip social pleasantries when something mattered. "The motel?" Margaret took a careful sip, buying time. "It's adequate. I'm not talking about thread count on the sheets, and you know it." Dolly's voice carried the authority of 5 decades running this diner, watching families rise and fall over coffee and conversation. "How bad is the situation at the farm?" Margaret studied her reflection in the coffee's dark surface. "Bad enough that Beth felt she had no choice. Beth's been coming in here twice a week since David died," Dolly said quietly. "Orders black coffee and sits in the back booth, staring at nothing. Doesn't eat, barely talks. That girl's drowning, Margaret." The words hit harder than Margaret expected. She'd been so focused on her own displacement, her own hurt, that she hadn't considered what desperation might drive someone to break 43 years of family tradition. I knew she was struggling, but did you? Dolly's tone remained gentle, but her eyes were uncompromising. Or did you know she was supposed to be struggling? There's a difference. Margaret set down her mug with more force than necessary. What's that supposed to mean? It means you've been living in that house for 6 months since David died, watching that girl work herself to the bone, and somehow you missed that she was falling apart. Dolly leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She's been taking double shifts at the grain elevator and cleaning offices in town. Did you know that? The information hit like a physical blow. Margaret had known Beth worked at the elevator. She'd worked there since high school. But cleaning offices? When? She never said, course she didn't. Beth Hansen asking for help? That girl would rather eat glass. Dolly's laugh held no humor. Wonder where she learned that particular skill. The accusation hung between them like smoke from the grill, acrid and impossible to ignore. Margaret wanted to defend herself, to explain that she'd offered help, had tried to contribute. But the offerings had been small things: cooking dinner, watching Tommy, maintaining the house. She'd never asked about the bills piling on David's old desk, never questioned why Beth always looked exhausted, never pushed past the polite fiction that everything was manageable. David came to see me, Dolly continued, her voice even quieter, now. 3 weeks before the accident. Sat right here in this booth and cried like a baby. Said he didn't know how to tell you they were losing the farm. Margaret's world tilted slightly, the familiar diner suddenly feeling foreign and strange. That's impossible. David told me everything. David told you what you wanted to hear. Just like his father did. Just like that boy learned to do. Dolly's eyes were kind but relentless. You want the truth, Margaret? Your son was terrified of disappointing you. Terrified of admitting that 4 generations of Hansen farming might end on his watch. The coffee turned bitter in Margaret's mouth. She thought of David's last months, how quiet he'd become, how he'd started taking longer to return her calls, how he'd seemed distracted during their Sunday dinners. She'd attributed it to grief over Harold's death, to the normal stresses of farming. She'd never imagined he was carrying the weight of failure, of promises he couldn't keep. The bank wants to foreclose, Dolly said, filling the silence. Beth's been fighting them for months, trying to work out payment plans, selling everything that isn't nailed down. That antique tractor David loved? Gone. The good livestock? Sold. She's been keeping the lights on with credit cards and prayer. Margaret felt something crumble inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her own righteousness. Why didn't she tell me? Same reason David didn't. Same reason you're sitting in a motel instead of asking for help. Dolly reached across the table and covered Margaret's hand with her own. Pride, honey. It's the Hansen family curse. The bell chimed again as new customers entered, bringing a gust of cold air and the reminder that life continued beyond this conversation. Margaret watched them settle into their booth, order their coffee, begin their own small rituals of connection and community. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of generational expectations and unspoken disappointments. I need to go back, Margaret said, though the words felt insufficient. You need to go back different than you left, Dolly corrected. Ready to listen instead of direct. Ready to help instead of judge. Margaret nodded, understanding for the first time that saving her family might require losing everything she thought she knew about being its matriarch. Margaret's boots crunched through the snow-covered gravel as she approached the First National Bank of Cedar Falls, the same institution where Harold had secured their first farm loan 45 years ago. The brick building looked smaller than she remembered, its windows reflecting the gray February sky like empty eyes. She'd called ahead, requesting a meeting with Jim Brewster, the loan officer who'd known the Hansen family since David was in diapers. The warmth inside the bank felt artificial, overlaid with the smell of fresh coffee and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Jim emerged from his office before she'd finished stamping snow from her boots, a tall, thin man whose kind eyes couldn't quite hide the discomfort of what he knew was coming. Margaret. He shook her hand with both of his, the gesture of someone delivering condolences. I'm so sorry about all of this. David was a good man. They settled into his office, its walls lined with photographs of successful farm families and certificates that proclaimed Jim's dedication to agricultural lending. Margaret noticed how he avoided meeting her eyes directly, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. I need to know the truth, Jim. Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. All of it. Jim's shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd been holding his breath for months. It started 3 years ago. Crop prices fell, and David had that bad harvest after the late frost. He came in looking for an extension on the mortgage. Margaret remembered that spring, the devastating cold snap that had blackened their wheat just as it was heading. David had been philosophical about it, calling it one of those years that every farmer faced eventually. She'd never imagined the true scope of the damage. We worked with him, Jim continued. David was good for it, always had been. But then, last year, he pulled out a thick file, its contents spilling across his desk like evidence of accumulated failures. Equipment breakdowns, medical bills after Harold's heart attack, rising fuel costs. David kept thinking he could farm his way out of it. The medical bills. Margaret's chest tightened as she remembered Harold's final months, the specialists in Fargo, the experimental treatments that insurance had only partially covered. She'd insisted they pursue every option, spare no expense. David had never once complained about the cost. How much? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Total debt? Including the second mortgage David took out last fall? Jim's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. $218,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, fighting the sensation that the floor was tilting beneath her feet. The farm Harold had built, that his father had carved from prairie grassland, reduced to a 6-figure debt that might as well have been $1 million. Beth doesn't know I'm here, Margaret said finally. Beth's been fighting this for 6 months. Jim's tone held deep respect. That girl's got more grit than half the men I deal with. She's managed to keep current on the interest, even negotiated, a forbearance on the principal. But Margaret. He shook his head slowly. Unless something changes, we'll have to initiate foreclosure proceedings by May. Margaret left the bank feeling hollow, as if someone had reached inside her chest and scooped out everything vital. She drove aimlessly through town, past the grain elevator where Beth worked her regular shifts, past the high school where Tommy spent his days pretending his world wasn't crumbling, past the small white church where Pastor Jim Nordahl had officiated at David's funeral just 6 months ago. The church parking lot was empty except for Pastor Jim's old Buick. Margaret found herself pulling in, drawn by something she couldn't name. Desperation, perhaps, or the simple need to sit somewhere quiet where grief was allowed. Pastor Jim looked up from his computer as she knocked on his office door frame. He was younger than his 55 years suggested, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of gentle eyes that invited confession. He'd moved to Cedar Falls 15 years ago, an outsider who'd gradually earned the community's trust through hospital visits and quiet acts of kindness. Margaret. He rose immediately, gesturing toward the chairs arranged near his window. I've been thinking about you. How are you managing? The question opened something inside her that she'd been holding closed since that morning at the bank. Jim, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did David come to see you before he died? Pastor Jim's pause told her everything before he spoke. You know I can't discuss pastoral conversations, Margaret. But he studied his hands, weathered from years of farm work before his calling to ministry. I can tell you that your son was carrying burdens he felt he couldn't share. About the farm. About many things. David was a man who measured his worth by his ability to provide, to protect, to continue what his father and grandfather had built. Pastor Jim's voice was careful, measured, when that ability felt threatened. Margaret thought of David's last weeks, how he'd grown quiet during their Sunday dinners, how he'd started avoiding her calls, how he'd seemed to be retreating into himself. She'd attributed it to normal grief over Harold's death, never imagining the deeper currents of shame and fear that were pulling him under. "He was afraid of disappointing me," she said, the words tasting like ashes. "He loved you very much." Sometimes love can become its own kind of burden, especially when it comes with expectations that feel impossible to meet. The afternoon light was fading by the time Margaret left the church, but she had one more stop to make. The Hansen farm sat 3 miles north of town, its buildings huddled against the prairie wind like survivors of some ancient battle. She parked by the machine shed, the same spot where David used to leave his truck after long days in the fields. The barn was unlocked. It always had been. Crime was rare enough in Cedar Falls that most farmers still trusted in community honesty and mutual respect. Margaret breathed in the familiar smell of hay and motor oil, the scent that had perfumed David's clothes and hands for as long as she could remember. She found what she was looking for in David's old workbench, tucked beneath, a stack of farm magazines and seed catalogs, a spiral notebook, its pages filled with David's careful handwriting, account balances, payment schedules, calculations that grew increasingly desperate as the months progressed. But it was the final entry that broke her heart. "Can't tell Mom? About the farm. Can't be the one who loses everything Dad and Grandpa built. Maybe if I take out one more loan, maybe if the corn prices improve, maybe if I can just hold on until—" The entry ended mid-sentence, as if David had simply run, out of maybes to cling to. Margaret closed the notebook and held it against her chest, finally understanding the weight her son had carried alone. Outside, the wind howled across the empty fields, and somewhere in that sound, she heard the echo of all the conversations they'd never had, all the help she'd never offered, all the love that had somehow transformed into pressure too heavy for one man to bear. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of making amends. Tonight, she would sit in this barn where David had spent his final weeks planning miracles that would never come, and she would finally allow herself to grieve not just for her son, but for the family they might have been if they'd learned how to be honest with each other. Part 5. The Attempted Bridge. Margaret's hands shook as she turned into the farm's gravel driveway, the familiar crunch of stones beneath her tires sounding different now. Hesitant, uncertain. The house looked smaller in the gray afternoon light, its white siding weathered by another week of February wind. Smoke rose from the chimney, a sign that someone was home, that life continued even after she'd been expelled from it. She sat in her car for a full minute, engine running, heat blasting against the windshield that kept fogging with her nervous breathing. Through the kitchen window, she could see Beth moving about, probably preparing dinner. Such a normal sight, a woman in her own kitchen, tending to the daily rituals that kept a family fed and functioning. Margaret had performed those same movements for decades, and now she was on the outside looking in, a stranger to her own life. The notebook sat heavy in her purse, David's desperate calculations and unfinished sentences a weight she could no longer carry alone. She turned off the engine and forced herself out of the car before courage could abandon her entirely. Beth's face appeared in the kitchen window as Margaret approached the front door. Their old front door with its brass knocker shaped like a wheat sheaf that Harold had installed for their 20th anniversary. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and Margaret saw something flicker across Beth's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or fear. Margaret knocked, though the gesture felt absurd. 6 months ago, she'd lived here. This had been her home, her kitchen, her family. Now she stood on the porch like a door-to-door salesman, waiting for permission to enter. Beth opened the door but didn't step aside. She wore one of David's old flannel shirts over her jeans, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked thinner than Margaret remembered. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that couldn't quite hide how it had grown past due for a trim. Another small economy in a life suddenly full of them. Margaret. Beth's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. I need to talk to you. Margaret kept her own tone steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Please. Beth hesitated, glancing back toward the kitchen where something was simmering on the stove. Finally, she stepped aside, though her posture remained rigid. Tommy's not home yet. He's at basketball practice. The kitchen felt both familiar and foreign, like visiting a childhood home that had been redecorated by strangers. The same oak table where they'd shared thousands of meals, but the chairs were arranged differently. The same blue curtains Harold had complained about for years, but they hung crooked now, as if no one had the energy for small perfectionist touches. Margaret noticed what she'd missed during her 6 months of living here. The stack of bills held down by a coffee mug, the calculator permanently stationed beside the telephone, the way Beth's purse sat open on the counter with its contents spilling out like the debris of a life lived too quickly. Coffee? Beth asked, though her tone suggested she hoped Margaret would decline. Please. Margaret sat at the table, choosing the chair that had always been Harold's rather than her own customary spot. The change felt symbolic, necessary. Beth poured 2 cups from the pot that had been sitting too long, the coffee dark and slightly bitter. She didn't offer cream or sugar, didn't engage in the small courtesies that had once smoothed their interactions. Instead, she sat across from Margaret with her hands wrapped around her mug like a shield. I went to the bank today, Margaret said without preamble. The words landed between them like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that couldn't be taken back. Beth's face went white, then red, then settled into something harder than stone. You had no right. I had every right. This is my family, my son's legacy. Your son is dead. Beth's voice cut like broken glass. And this is my problem now. Mine and Tommy's. The words hung in the air between them, cruel and true and impossible to argue with. Margaret felt the familiar surge of defensive anger, the instinct to assert her authority, to remind Beth of her place in the family hierarchy. But David's notebook seemed to pulse in her purse, a reminder of what such expectations had cost. $218,000, Margaret said quietly. Beth's composure cracked slightly. Jim Brewster violated client confidentiality. Jim Brewster watched my son take out loans to pay for my husband's medical bills. Margaret's voice grew stronger, fueled by the weight of her newfound understanding. He watched David mortgage our future to keep me from losing Harold. He was trying to protect all of us. Beth set down her coffee mug with shaking hands. It's too late, Margaret. The damage is done. I have savings. The words tumbled out before Margaret could second-guess them. Harold's life insurance, our retirement accounts, the money from selling the cattle. It's not enough to clear everything, but it could buy us time. Us? Beth's laugh was sharp and bitter. There is no us. You made that clear when you left. You told me to leave. And you did. Beth was on her feet now, pacing to the window and back, her movements jerky with suppressed emotion. No argument. No fight, no attempt to work things out. You just packed your bags and walked away from your family. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. You said you didn't have space for me. I said we didn't have space for you to control everything. Beth whirled to face her, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. For you to hover and judge and tell me I was doing everything wrong while my world fell apart. The truth of it hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought of her last weeks in this house, how she'd criticized Beth's cooking, questioned her parenting decisions, offered unsolicited advice about everything from Tommy's homework to the best way to organize the pantry, all of it well-intentioned, all of it devastating to someone already drowning. "I was trying to help," Margaret whispered. "You were trying to be needed." Beth sank back into her chair, suddenly looking older than her 42 years. "David used to say? He used to say you'd rather be right than happy." Margaret flinched. Those had been Harold's words, thrown at her during arguments she'd thought were long forgotten. Apparently, some family insights got passed down along with eye color and farming techniques. "I found David's notebook," Margaret said, pulling it from her purse and setting it on the table between them. "In the barn." Beth stared at the notebook as if it might bite her. "I looked everywhere for that. He was afraid to tell me about the farm, afraid he'd failed me." "He did fail." "You!" Beth's voice was hollow now, drained of anger. "We all did. The great Hansen legacy, reduced to a pile of debt and broken dreams." "The legacy isn't the land," Margaret said, surprising herself with the words. "It's the family. It's Tommy. It's you carrying on when everything seemed impossible." Beth looked up sharply, searching Margaret's face for signs of manipulation or false comfort. Whatever she found there made her shoulders sag slightly, as if she'd been holding them rigid for months. "I can't take your money," Beth said finally. "I won't be responsible for you losing everything, too." "You're not responsible for anything. I'm offering because I want to, because David would want me to, because Tommy deserves better than watching his family destroy itself over pride." They sat in silence as shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor. Outside, Margaret heard the rumble of the school bus, followed by Tommy's familiar footsteps on the front porch. Both women instinctively straightened, smoothing their expressions into something approaching normalcy. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his dark hair tousled from basketball practice. His eyes moved between the two women, taking in the coffee cups, the notebook on the table, the subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that suggested important conversations had been taking place. "Grandma?" His voice was carefully neutral, but Margaret caught the hope he was trying to hide. "Hello, sweetheart." Margaret's throat felt tight. "How was practice?" "Good. Coach says I might make varsity next year." Tommy looked between them again. Are you coming home?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Margaret glanced at Beth, who was staring down at her hands, her jaw working as if she were trying to swallow words that wanted to escape. "We're working on some things," Margaret said carefully. "Adults' things that need to be figured out." Tommy nodded, the gesture of someone accustomed to adult evasions. "I'm going to do homework." After he disappeared upstairs, the kitchen felt larger and emptier. Beth traced patterns on the table with her finger, not meeting Margaret's eyes. "He misses you," Beth said quietly. "I miss him too. I miss all of this." Margaret gestured around. The kitchen, encompassing not just the room, but everything it represented. "But I understand now that missing something isn't the same as deserving it back." Beth finally looked up, and Margaret saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger or resentment, but exhaustion so profound it seemed to have settled into her bones. "I don't know how to do this alone," Beth whispered. "I don't know how to save the farm, how to help Tommy, how to be everything David was. I'm failing at all of it." "You're not failing. You're surviving." Margaret reached across the table, covering Beth's hand with her own. "And you're not alone. Not if you don't want to be." For a moment, Beth didn't pull away. For a moment, they sat connected by touch and shared grief and the tentative possibility that some broken things could be mended. Then Beth's walls came back up, and she withdrew her hand. "I need time to think," Beth said. "About the money. About everything." Margaret nodded, understanding that some bridges had to be built slowly, board by board. I'm staying at the Sunset Motel, room 14. When you're ready to talk, I'll be there. The drive back to town felt different than it had an hour earlier. The notebook was gone from her purse, left on Beth's kitchen table like a bridge between past and future. Margaret didn't know if her daughter-in-law would accept her help, didn't know if their family could be rebuilt, or if it was too damaged to save. But for the first time since she'd packed her bags and left this place, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Small and fragile, like the first green shoots that pushed through North Dakota snow, but real enough to keep her moving forward. The blue house sat back from the street behind a yard that showed signs of recent attention, snow shoveled in neat paths, the driveway scraped clean despite fresh snowfall during the night. Ray paused at the bottom of the wheelchair ramp, fishing keys from his pocket while giving Margaret a moment to reconsider. Dad has good days and bad days, he explained quietly. The stroke affected his speech, so sometimes he gets frustrated when words don't come out the way he wants them to. But his mind is sharp as ever, sharper maybe, because he has more time to think. Margaret nodded, understanding the delicate balance between honesty and hope that caregivers learn to navigate. She'd walked that line during Harold's final months, watching a brilliant man struggle against a body that increasingly refused to cooperate. The interior of the house surprised her with its warmth and organization. She'd expected the sterile efficiency of a medical facility, but instead found a home that had been thoughtfully adapted rather than transformed. Grab bars installed with an eye for aesthetics as well as function. Furniture rearranged to accommodate a wheelchair without sacrificing comfort. Family photographs clustered on tables within easy reach. "Dad, I brought someone to meet you." Ray's voice carried the particular tone adult children developed when addressing elderly parents, respectful but cheerful, loud enough to penetrate hearing loss without being condescending. Arthur Carlson sat in a motorized wheelchair positioned to look out the front window, a newspaper spread across the table beside him, and a coffee mug within easy reach. Margaret recognized him immediately despite the changes. The slight droop to the left side of his face, the careful way he held his left arm, the same gentle eyes that had helped her find the right screws for loose cabinet hinges over the years. "Arthur," she said warmly, approaching his chair. "It's Margaret Hansen. I don't know if you remember me, but I used to come into your store quite often." Arthur's face lit up with recognition, and he lifted his good hand toward her. His speech was slow but clear. "Margaret, Harold's wife. How are you holding up?" The question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly undid her composure. "Some days better than others. I was sorry to hear about your stroke." "Could be worse," Arthur managed, his eyes twinkling with the same wry humor she remembered from the hardware store. "Could be. Dead." Ray appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray with fresh coffee and what looked like homemade cookies. "Dad's been reading about the farm situation in the Tribune. He follows agricultural news like some people follow sports scores." Arthur nodded emphatically. "Tough times. For family operations. Seen it before. In the 80s. Margaret accepted a cup of coffee and settled into the chair Ray indicated, feeling unexpectedly comfortable in this house of strangers, who somehow didn't feel strange at all. "It's been difficult. David, my son, he tried so hard to keep everything together." "Good boy," Arthur said firmly. "Came to the store. Always polite. Always paid. His bills on time." Ray settled into his own chair, and Margaret noticed how naturally he positioned himself within his father's sightline while still being part of the conversation. The choreography of caregiving, she realized, the constant small adjustments that made dignity possible. "Ray tells me you have some experience with financial planning," Margaret said, then immediately worried she was being too forward. "I don't mean to impose, but—" "Please," Ray said, holding up a hand. "No imposing. If I can help, I'd like to. It's one of the things I miss about my old job, actually being able to solve problems for people instead of just managing them. Arthur was nodding vigorously. Ray helped. Mrs. Patterson, remember son? The widow? With the tax problems? That was different, Dad. Simpler. Ray looked slightly embarrassed. But it's true that sometimes fresh eyes can see solutions that aren't obvious when you're in the middle of a crisis. Margaret found herself explaining the situation again. The debt, the bank's timeline, her offer to help financially, Beth's resistance to accepting money. Ray listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed his professional background without making her feel like she was being evaluated. The key, Ray said when she finished, is presenting the bank with a comprehensive plan that addresses both the immediate crisis and the long-term sustainability. Beth's been fighting a defensive battle, trying to make minimum payments and hoping for a miracle. What you need is an offensive strategy. I'm not sure I understand the difference. Ray leaned forward, his expression becoming more animated. Defensive is, please don't foreclose, we'll try to catch up. Offensive is, here's our 5-year plan to not only catch up, but to modernize operations and improve profitability. Banks respond much better to the second approach. Arthur was nodding along, his good hand gesturing as if he wanted to contribute. Tell her. About the Peterson place. Right. Ray turned back to Margaret. There was a family north of town. Similar situation to yours. They were about to lose their farm when they brought in a consultant who helped them restructure everything. Converted part of their land to organic production, started selling direct to restaurants in Fargo. Now they're doing better than they ever did with traditional commodity farming. Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. You think that could work for our place? I think it's worth exploring, but the first step is getting Beth to agree to work with you. Pride is the biggest obstacle to solutions in situations like this. They talked for another hour, Ray sketching out possibilities while Arthur contributed observations from his decades of watching farm families navigate economic pressures. Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, surrounded by people who understood problems without judging the people who had them. When she finally prepared to leave, Arthur caught her hand with his good one. Margaret, don't give up. Families are worth fighting for. Ray walked her back toward town, their conversation continuing as they retraced their morning route. The sun had climbed higher, warming the air enough that Margaret could unzip her coat. Thank you, she said as they approached the diner parking lot. For the coffee, for the advice, for treating me like a person instead of a problem. You're welcome. And Margaret? Ray paused beside her car. If you decide you want help putting together a formal proposal for the bank, I'd be happy to assist. No charge, just neighbors helping neighbors. Margaret studied his face, looking for hidden motives or calculations. Instead, she saw the same straightforward kindness she'd observed in the diner, tempered now by professional competence and genuine concern. I'll think about it, she said. And Ray? Your father is lucky to have you. Margaret had been staring at her phone for 20 minutes, Ray's business card propped against the lamp beside her notepad. The motel room felt smaller in the evening, light, its beige walls pressing closer as she debated whether to make the call that could change everything or postpone it for another day of careful consideration. Her conversation with Ray had planted seeds of possibility, but seeds needed action to grow. She'd spent the afternoon organizing her thoughts, calculating figures, and drafting what amounted to a business proposal for saving her family's farm. The numbers looked promising on paper. Her savings combined with a restructured loan could provide the breathing room needed to implement some of Ray's suggestions. But numbers were only as good as the people willing to act on them. The phone rang before she could pick it up, startling her so badly she knocked over her water glass. Beth's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret's heart began beating faster as she answered. Margaret? Beth's voice sounded strained, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about your offer. I'm glad you called. Margaret mopped up the spilled water with a motel towel, grateful for something to do with her hands. I know it's not an easy decision. Nothing's easy anymore. Beth's laugh held no humor. I got another notice from the bank today. They want to meet next week to discuss next steps. I know what that means. Margaret's chest tightened. How much time do we have? They're giving us until the end of March to bring the account current or present an acceptable payment plan. 6 weeks, basically. Beth's voice cracked slightly. I've been looking at the numbers all afternoon, Margaret. Even with your help, I don't see how we can make this work. The farm isn't profitable enough to support the debt load, even if we catch up on payments. What if we could change that? Make it more profitable? How? Commodity prices are what they are. We can't grow more corn on the same acres, and we can't afford to buy more land. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling as if she were stepping off a cliff. I met someone today, a financial advisor who's helped other farms in similar situations. He thinks there might be options we haven't considered. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Beth spoke, her voice carefully controlled. What kind of options? Diversification, organic farming, direct marketing to restaurants, converting part of the operation to higher-value crops. Margaret could hear herself gaining confidence as she spoke, Ray's enthusiasm becoming her own. He says the key is presenting the bank with a comprehensive business plan instead of just asking for more time. Margaret. Beth's tone carried a warning. I can't afford consultants. I can barely afford groceries. He's offering to help for free, as a neighbor. Margaret hurried on before Beth could object. I know what you're thinking, that I'm trying to take over again. Bring in outsiders to solve problems you should handle yourself. But Beth, what if this isn't about taking over? What if it's about working together? Another long pause. Margaret could hear Tommy's voice in the background, asking about something related to homework. The sound of normal family life continuing despite the crisis made her chest ache with longing. Who is this person? Beth asked finally. Margaret explained about Ray Carlson, his background, his move to Cedar Falls to care for his father. She described their conversation at the diner, the visit to Arthur's house, the genuine concern both men had shown for the situation. He moved here from Minneapolis to take care of his dad, Margaret concluded. Gave up his career, his whole life, because family mattered more than success. I think he understands what we're dealing with. And you trust him? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went beyond Ray's qualifications. Beth was really asking whether Margaret's judgment could be trusted, whether her track record of controlling behavior had been replaced by something more collaborative. I think he's worth listening to, Margaret said carefully. But the decision would be yours, Beth. Your farm, your choice. Our farm. Beth's correction was so quiet Margaret almost missed it. David always said it was our farm, not his. That families built these places, not individuals. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. David was right. Would you? Beth hesitated, then seemed to gather courage. Would you be willing to meet with both of us? You and this Ray person and me? I want to hear what he has to say, but I need you there too. For David. Of course. Margaret's voice was steadier than her hands. Whenever you want. Tomorrow, after Tommy gets home from school. I don't want him worrying about adult problems. But I want him in the house. It feels safer with him there. Margaret understood. Tommy represented continuity, hope, the future they were all fighting to preserve. His presence would remind them what they were really trying to save. I'll call Ray and set it up, Margaret said. Beth? Thank you. For trusting me enough to try this. Don't thank me yet. I'm still not sure this isn't a mistake. Beth's tone softened slightly. But I'm tired, Margaret. I'm tired of fighting everything alone. Tired of feeling like I'm failing David and Tommy and you all at the same time. If there's a chance this could work. There is. I really believe there is. After Beth hung up, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness of her motel room, phone still clutched in her hand. The conversation had felt different from their previous interactions. Less defensive, more collaborative. Like two people working toward the same goal instead of fighting over who had the right to lead. She dialed Ray's number before she could second-guess herself. "Margaret? How are you doing?" "Better, I think. Beth wants to meet with us tomorrow. She's finally ready to consider outside help." "That's excellent news." Ray's enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. "What changed her?" "Mind?" Another notice from the bank. "Sometimes desperation accomplishes what logic can't." Unfortunately, that's often how it works. People have to be convinced they're truly cornered before they're willing to try something different. Ray paused, and Margaret could hear papers rustling in the background. "I've been doing some research on your situation, actually. Looking at comparable farms, recent sales data, that sort of thing. I think there are definitely viable options." "You've been researching us? I hope that doesn't bother you. It's just that once I heard the basic situation, my brain started working on solutions automatically. Occupational hazard." Ray's tone was apologetic but not defensive. "I found some interesting possibilities, but I'd rather present them tomorrow when Beth is there too. She's the one who really needs to understand the options." Margaret appreciated his awareness of family dynamics, his instinct to include Beth rather than bypass her. "What time works for you?" "Whenever is convenient for Beth. I'm flexible." They arranged to meet at 4 o'clock the following afternoon, after Tommy's school day ended but before dinner preparations began. Ray would bring documentation to support his recommendations, and Margaret would provide moral support and whatever financial backing proved necessary. After ending the call, Margaret realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation rather than dread about family interaction. Not because she expected the meeting to go smoothly, but because for the first time since David's death, they were all working toward the same objective instead of defending different versions of what should happen. She pulled out her notebook and began preparing for tomorrow's conversation, listing questions Beth might ask and concerns she might raise. The financial projections Ray had sketched looked promising, but the human dynamics would be more challenging to navigate. Beth's pride, her own controlling instincts, Ray's outsider status, all potential obstacles to the collaboration they needed. But obstacles weren't impossibilities. Margaret had learned that lesson the hard way over the past 2 weeks, watching her certainties crumble and rebuild into something more flexible and honest. Pride was expensive, as Ray had said. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was let someone help you, even when it hurt your self-image. Tomorrow, she would find out whether her family was ready to pay that price. Margaret closed her notebook and prepared for bed, feeling cautiously optimistic for the first time since Beth's ultimatum had sent her into exile. The motel room still felt temporary and foreign, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a way station between the woman she'd been and whoever she was becoming. Outside, snow began falling again, dusting the parking lot with fresh possibility. By morning, the world would look clean and new, ready for whatever changes courage and collaboration could accomplish. Margaret watched the snow through her window, until her eyes grew heavy, then closed the curtains on another day of preparation for whatever tomorrow might bring. The last thing she thought before sleep claimed her was how different this anticipation felt from the anxiety that had plagued her for weeks. This felt like hope tempered by realism, excitement balanced by the hard-won knowledge that some things couldn't be controlled, only influenced through patience and careful attention to what other people needed rather than what she thought they should want. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities for both success and failure. But tonight, Margaret Hansen slept more soundly than she had since the morning Beth had asked her to leave. dreaming of farmhouses where 3 generations could live and work together without sacrificing their individual dignity to the demands of family tradition. The snow continued falling through the night, covering the sharp edges of winter with the soft promise of spring, still months away but no longer impossible to imagine. In the distance, the lights of the farm where Beth and Tommy slept glowed, warm against the darkness, marking home as a place Margaret might yet return to, not as the controlling matriarch she'd been, but as the collaborative family member she was learning to become. 6 weeks until the bank's deadline. 42 days to prove that love and money and careful planning could overcome the accumulated weight of debt and damaged relationships. It would require more grace than pride, more listening than directing, more trust than control. Margaret had never faced a challenge that demanded so much change from who she'd always been. But then again, she'd never had so much to lose, or so many people depending on her willingness to become someone better than the woman who'd packed her bags and left her family when they needed her most. Tomorrow would be the first real test of whether transformation was possible at 68, whether old dogs could indeed learn new tricks when the alternative was losing everything that mattered. Margaret slept deeply, gathering strength for whatever that test might require. "I'm the lucky one," Ray replied. "Moving here has reminded me that success isn't always measured in dollars and career advancement. Sometimes it's measured in coffee shared with new friends and problems solved for people who matter." As Margaret drove back to the Sunset Motel, she found herself thinking not just about financial strategies and bank negotiations, but about the unexpected connections that could form when pride stepped aside long enough to allow friendship. Ray Carlson represented something she hadn't expected to find in Cedar Falls, the possibility that starting over might mean building something better than what had been lost. Her room at the Sunset felt different when she entered it, less like a place of exile and more like a temporary headquarters for planning whatever came next. She pulled out a notepad and began writing down everything Ray had suggested, organizing the ideas into something that resembled a strategy rather than a series of desperate measures. For the first time since Beth's ultimatum had sent her packing, Margaret felt like she had more to offer her family than money and good intentions. She had connections now, resources, and perhaps most importantly, a clearer understanding of the difference between helping and controlling. The question remained whether Beth would be willing to accept help from someone who had spent decades making her feel inadequate. But that conversation would have to wait for another day. Tonight, Margaret would plan. Tomorrow, she would find the courage to try again. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the North Dakota prairie, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Tommy was probably doing homework at the kitchen table, while Beth prepared dinner and worried about bills she couldn't pay. Her family, damaged but not destroyed, carrying on without her but not, she hoped, forever. Margaret pulled the curtains closed and turned on the desk lamp, spreading her notes across the small table. There was work to do. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clarity that seemed to extend far beyond the weather. Margaret stood at the window of her small apartment above Dolly's diner, watching the first crocuses push through the melting snow in the tiny garden plot behind the building. Spring in North Dakota was always a revelation, the way life could emerge from what seemed like endless winter, stubborn and beautiful and full of possibility. It had been 2 months since that night when the blizzard had trapped her and Beth in the farmhouse, forcing them to finally speak the truths they'd been carrying like stones in their hearts. 2 months since Beth had broken down and revealed David's final weeks, his sense of failure, his fear that he'd disappointed everyone who'd ever believed in him. 2 months since Margaret had looked into the mirror of her daughter-in-law's grief and seen her own mistakes reflected back. The healing hadn't been immediate or easy. There had been awkward conversations, tentative steps forward followed by retreats into old patterns. But gradually, like the snow giving way to spring, something new had begun to emerge between them. Not the relationship they'd had before. That was gone, broken beyond repair, but something more honest, more real. "Morning, beautiful." Ray's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and the comfortable intimacy they'd built over the past months. He set a cup of coffee on the small table by the window and wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Margaret leaned back against him, still amazed by how natural this felt. At 68, she'd never expected to find love again. Certainly not the kind of love that made her feel like a woman instead of just a grandmother or a burden. Ray had changed that, with his patient courtship and his understanding of what it meant to start over in the second half of life. "Tommy's coming by this afternoon," she said, watching a robin hop across the patch of grass that was slowly emerging from winter's grip. "He wants to show me his college acceptance letter." "The one from state?" Ray's pride was evident in his voice. He'd grown fond of Tommy over the past months, serving as something like a grandfather figure now that Harold was gone. "Agricultural business program? The very one." Margaret couldn't keep the smile from her voice. "He says he wants to learn the modern way to run a farm, but he still wants to come back and work the land. Beth's been teaching him about sustainable practices, crop rotation, all the things David never had time to learn." It was one of the unexpected gifts of their rebuilding, watching Beth emerge as a true farmer, not just someone trying to hold onto her husband's legacy. She'd thrown herself into learning everything she could about agriculture, spending her evenings reading farming journals and attending extension office seminars. The woman who'd once seemed overwhelmed by the farm's demands had discovered a talent and passion for the work that surprised everyone, including herself. "And how's our Beth doing with her expansion plans?" Ray asked, settling into the chair across from Margaret's small kitchen table. Excited, nervous, determined. Margaret sipped her coffee, thinking about the conversation she'd had with Beth just the day before. "She wants to add a greenhouse operation, maybe some organic vegetables for the farmers market. The loan officer seems impressed with her business plan." It was strange, Margaret reflected, how crisis could reveal strengths nobody knew existed. Beth had always been seen as the quiet one, the young woman who'd married into the Hansen family, and tried to fit into roles that were already defined. But faced with the choice between losing everything or fighting for it, she'd discovered reserves of determination and intelligence that had been dormant for years. The apartment door opened, and Dolly's voice called up the stairs. "Margaret, you've got visitors." Margaret and Ray exchanged glances. It was still early for Tommy, and they weren't expecting anyone else. Margaret made her way downstairs, Ray following, to find Beth standing in the diner's doorway holding a covered dish, her face flushed from the spring air. "I made too much pot roast," Beth said, the words coming out in a rush. "Thought maybe you and Ray might want some." It was a small gesture, but Margaret understood its significance. 6 months ago, Beth would never have thought to include Margaret in her cooking plans. 6 months ago, they'd been locked in a battle over territory and belonging that had nearly destroyed them both. Now Beth was standing in the diner, offering food like the peace offering it was. "That's very thoughtful," Margaret said, accepting the dish. "Would you like to stay for coffee? Dolly's got fresh pie." "I can't stay long. I've got to get back to check on the calves." Beth's smile was genuine, but Margaret could see the constant awareness of responsibility that had become her daughter-in-law's permanent expression. "But maybe just for a few minutes." They settled at one of the diner's corner booths, the same one where Margaret had first confided in Dolly about her displacement all those months ago. Beth accepted a cup of coffee and a slice of Dolly's famous apple pie, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence. "Tommy's been talking about his college plans," Beth said finally. "He's excited about the agricultural business program, but he's also worried about leaving me alone with the farm." "You won't be alone," Margaret said quietly. "You've got the Carlsons helping with the heavy work, and Jim Peterson said he'd lend a hand during planting season." "I know. It's just—" Beth paused, searching for words. Sometimes I still can't believe I'm doing this. Running a farm, making business decisions, applying for loans. A year ago, I was just trying to keep my head above water. Ray leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You know, I've been thinking about that greenhouse idea of yours. In Minneapolis, I worked with several small businesses that were transitioning to sustainable practices. If you're interested, I could help you put together some financial projections, maybe look at grant opportunities. Beth's eyes lit up. Really? You'd do that? Of course. We're family now, aren't we? The word hung in the air between them, full of new meaning. Not family in the way they'd been before, with all the unspoken expectations and resentments, but family by choice, by commitment to each other's well-being and success. There's something else, Beth said, her cheeks coloring slightly. I've met someone at the extension office. His name is Mark, and he's an agricultural consultant. We've been talking about farming practices, and he's been helping me with some of the technical aspects of the greenhouse project. Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been concern, but she pushed it down. Beth was 42, years old, a grown woman who'd been widowed for almost a year. She had every right to companionship, to love, to a future that included more than just struggle and survival. That's wonderful, Margaret said, and meant it. I'd like to meet him. Sometime. He's not David. Beth's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. No, Margaret agreed. He's not. But David's gone, Beth. And you're still here, still living, still building something. David would want you to be happy. It was true, Margaret realized. David had loved Beth, had wanted her to have a full life. He would never have wanted her to remain trapped in grief and financial struggle, would never have expected her to live as a monument to his memory. I miss him, Beth said simply. I'll always miss him. But I'm starting to think that missing someone and moving forward don't have to be mutually exclusive. No, Margaret said, thinking of her own journey from grief to this new life with Ray. They don't. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Tommy burst in, his face bright with excitement and spring air. He was carrying a large envelope, and Margaret knew without being told that it contained his official acceptance to the agricultural program at State. Grandma! Mom! I got it! He waved the envelope like a flag of victory. Full acceptance, and they're offering me a partial scholarship. Beth's face transformed with pride and relief. Tommy, that's wonderful! Ray stood to shake the boy's hand, his own face beaming. Congratulations, son. You've earned this. They spent the next hour poring over the acceptance materials, discussing course schedules and living arrangements, making plans for a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. Tommy would start in the fall, studying agricultural business and sustainable farming practices. He'd come home on weekends to help with the farm work, and after graduation, he'd return to implement what he'd learned, to build on the foundation Beth was laying. I've been thinking, Tommy said as they finished their second round of coffee. When I graduate, maybe we could expand the operation. Not just the greenhouse, but maybe look into some of the new farming technologies, precision, agriculture, that kind of thing. Slow down there, entrepreneur, Beth laughed. Let's get you through your first semester before we start planning our agricultural empire. But Margaret could see the excitement in her daughter-in-law's eyes, the way she was already envisioning the possibilities. This was what healing looked like, she realized. Not just the absence of pain, but the presence of hope. The ability to look forward instead of just surviving day by day. As the afternoon wore on and Tommy and Beth prepared to head back to the farm, Margaret felt a sense of completion that had been missing for months. The family she'd lost in that bitter February confrontation was gone, but something new had taken its place. Something more flexible, more honest, more capable of withstanding the storms that life inevitably brought. Margaret, Beth said as she gathered her things, I want you to know. What we have now, it's better than what we had before. More real. Margaret nodded, understanding completely. Yes, she said. It is. After they left, Margaret and Ray climbed the stairs to their small apartment, where spring light was streaming through the windows and the future stretched ahead of them like an open field, ready for planting. The first anniversary of David's death arrived with an unseasonably warm day in early March, as if the earth itself was ready to celebrate life instead of mourning loss. Margaret stood in the farmhouse kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd been, exiled a year ago, helping Beth arrange flowers that had been picked from the greenhouse they'd built together over the summer. These look beautiful, Margaret said, adjusting a spray of daffodils in one of the mason jars they were using as vases. The flowers were Beth's first successful greenhouse crop, bright yellow promises that winter would always give way to spring. David would have loved seeing them, Beth replied, her voice steady. She'd grown into her grief over the past year, learning to carry it without being crushed by its weight. He always said March was too early for flowers in North Dakota, but he would have been proud of what we've accomplished. Through the window, Margaret could see the guests beginning to arrive for David's memorial celebration. It had been Tommy's idea. Instead of spending the day in sorrow, they would honor David's life with a gathering that celebrated everything he'd loved about the farm, the community, the family he'd left behind. Pastor Jim was setting up tables in the barn, which had been cleaned and decorated with string lights that cast a warm glow over the old wooden beams. Dolly had arrived early with enough food to feed half the county, insisting that any proper celebration required her famous pot roast and at least 3 different kinds of pie. Ray was helping the Carlson boys arrange hay bales for extra seating, his city clothes replaced by work jeans and boots that showed how thoroughly he'd adapted to rural life. Grandma, Mom, they're here. Tommy's voice carried from the front porch, bright with excitement. At 17, he'd grown tall and confident, his acceptance to State University having given him a sense of purpose and direction that reminded Margaret powerfully of David at the same age. Margaret smoothed her dress, a new one in spring green that Ray had helped her pick out, and took a deep breath. This day mattered more than she could articulate. It represented not just David's memory, but the family's ability to heal, to grow, to become something stronger than what they'd been before. The guests streamed in throughout the afternoon, neighbors who'd known David since childhood, fellow farmers who'd worked alongside him, teachers who remembered him from school, and friends from town who'd watched him grow up. Mark Anderson, Beth's gentle agricultural consultant who'd become a steady presence in their lives, arrived with his 2 teenage daughters, who immediately gravitated toward Tommy with the easy friendship of young people who understood the weight of loss. Margaret found herself moving through the crowd with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. These people weren't just here for David's memory. They were here because the Hansen family had become something worth celebrating. Beth's greenhouse operation was already earning praise from the Agricultural Extension Office. Tommy's academic achievements had made the local paper. Ray's financial consulting had helped 3 other farming families restructure their operations and avoid foreclosure. Mrs. Hansen? A young woman approached, her hand extended in greeting. I'm Sarah Peterson. I'm writing an article for the Regional Farming Journal about successful family operations. I was hoping I could talk to you about your family's transition over the past year. Margaret glanced around the barn, taking in the scene. Beth, deep in conversation with a group of farmers about sustainable agriculture practices, Tommy explaining his college plans to Pastor Jim, Ray teaching the Carlson children how to make paper airplanes from napkins while their parents relaxed with coffee and conversation. I'd be happy to talk, Margaret said, but I'm not sure I'm the right person. This success belongs to all of us. That's exactly what makes it interesting, Sarah replied, pulling out a small recording device. Most farming operations struggle with generational transitions. You've found a way to adapt and thrive despite significant challenges. Margaret considered this as she watched Beth demonstrate the greenhouse watering system to a group of interested visitors. "I think the key was learning that family doesn't have to look the way it always has," she said finally. "We had to let go of our old ideas about who was supposed to do what, who was supposed to live where, who was supposed to be in charge. Once we did that, we could see each other's actual strengths instead of just our expectations." "Can you give me an example?" Margaret smiled, thinking of how many examples she could offer. Beth was always seen as the quiet one, the one who needed taking care of. But when she had to step up and run this farm, she discovered she had a gift for it. Not just the daily work, but the business side, the planning, the innovation. She's applied for 3 different agricultural grants this year, and she's gotten them all. Through the crowd, Margaret caught sight of Dolly holding court at one of the food tables, regaling a group of women with some story that had them all laughing. At 73, Dolly had become not just Margaret's business partner in the diner, but her closest confidant and the unofficial keeper of the community's stories. "And what about your own transition?" Sarah asked. "It must have been difficult, leaving the farmhouse after so many years." Margaret felt Ray's presence before. She saw him, his hand settling gently on her lower back in the way that had become natural between them. "It was the hardest thing I'd ever done," she said honestly. "But it turned out to be the best thing, too. I discovered that I'm more than just someone's mother or grandmother. I'm a business owner, a partner, a woman who can still fall in love and build a new life at 68. "We're thinking of making it official," Ray said, his eyes twinkling. "If Margaret will have me." The announcement drew a small crowd, and Margaret found herself surrounded by congratulations and well wishes. It wasn't the proposal she might have imagined at 25, no down-on-one-knee moment or dramatic declarations. Instead, it was the kind of practical, joyful decision that mature love made possible. They would marry in the spring, combining their lives and their resources, building something together that honored both their independence and their commitment. "When?" Beth asked, appearing at Margaret's elbow with genuine excitement in her voice. "May," Margaret said. "Small ceremony, just family and close friends. We thought we'd have the reception here in the barn, if that's all right with you." "Of course it's all right. It's perfect." Beth's eyes were bright with tears, but they were happy tears, the kind that came with witnessing love instead of loss. As the afternoon wore on, Tommy stood to address the gathering, his young voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to speak difficult truths. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," he began. "A year ago, our family was broken. Dad's death had left us angry and scared and unable to talk to each other about what we were really feeling. But somehow, through all the fighting and the hurt, we found our way back to each other. Not to who we used to be, but to who we were meant to become." He paused, looking around the barn at the faces of friends and neighbors who'd watched their struggles and celebrated their recovery. "Dad always said that farming was about taking care of the land so it could take care of you. But I think family works the same way. You have to tend it. And sometimes that means making hard choices, having difficult conversations, letting go of things that aren't working anymore. But if you do the work, if you're willing to change and grow, then family becomes something that can sustain you through anything." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Margaret barely heard it. She was thinking about David, about the young man who'd felt trapped by expectations and traditions that no longer served his family's needs. She was thinking about how proud he would be of Tommy's wisdom, of Beth's strength, of the way his death had ultimately led not to the destruction of his family, but to its transformation. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift toward their cars, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen with Beth, washing dishes in companionable silence. It was a scene that could have been from any of the thousands of evenings they'd spent in this room over the years. But everything was different now. The tension was gone, replaced by a partnership based on choice rather than obligation. "Thank you," Beth said quietly, "for not giving up on us." Margaret dried a plate slowly, considering her response. "I think we all gave up on who we used to be," she said finally, "and that's what saved us." Outside, the North Dakota sky was beginning its spectacular spring sunset, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. The land that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving during that terrible February was revealing its gentler face, ready for another season of growth and possibility. Margaret looked out at the fields that stretched to the horizon, at the greenhouse that glowed with artificial light where Beth's plants were already reaching toward another harvest, at the barn where her family had just celebrated not just memory, but hope. This was what family meant, she realized. Not a fixed structure, but a living thing, capable of bending without breaking, of finding new forms when the old ones no longer fit. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain as always, but no longer frightening. They had learned how to rebuild from broken pieces, how to create strength from vulnerability, how to transform endings into beginnings. And that knowledge, Margaret knew, would carry them through whatever seasons lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.